My name's Sue Williamson and I'm the Director of Libraries for Arts Council England. I'm really excited to have been invited to take part in an event on the 7th of June at Harrogate Library, where I will be part of a panel discussing some of the books on the Big Jubilee Read. The Big Jubilee Read is 70 books for 70 years of the Queen's reign, all written by Commonwealth writers. One of my favourite books on that list is this one, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy by John le Carré. In my mind, one of the best spy novels ever written. Completely different from the contemporary James Bond series, there is no glitz and glamour in this book. Smiley has a brilliant brain, he's a fantastic spy, but as the Spectator describes him on the back of this book, a totally inadequate man. Is this the book that I'm going to be discussing in more depth as part of that event on the 7th of June? You're just going to have to come along to Harrogate Libraries for Twixt covers to find out.
Hello, my name's Cheryl Hesketh and I work as a development manager for Conwy Libraries in North Wales. I was delighted to be part of a panel who chose 70 titles from a Reader's Choice long list of books, celebrating great reads from across the Commonwealth to coincide with Her Majesty the Queen's Jubilee. The Big Jubilee Read is a fantastic reading for pleasure campaign from the Reading Agency and BBC Arts, which encourages us to discover new or forgotten books. One of the books I loved from the list is The Night Tiger by Yangtze Chu. Set in 1930s Malaya, it's a captivating tale by a wonderful storyteller, which includes mystery, murder, folk tales, magical realism and forbidden love. The characters will stay with you long after you finish the book. You won't be disappointed. But is it my favourite from the list? Join me and a panel of wonderful guests at Harrogate Library on June the 7th to find out. Look forward to seeing you there.
Hello, my name is James Nichol. I'm a children's author, a librarian, an ex-bookseller, and I spent the last 20 plus years recommending books to readers in various bookshops and libraries and in various roles, and it's something I really enjoy doing. And I'm very excited and honoured to have been invited to be part of the panel discussing a small selection of the books on the Big Jubilee Read list, which is a list of 70 titles published through the 70 years of the Queen's reign and written by authors from across the Commonwealth. And one of the books that features on that list is The Handmaid's Tale by the brilliant Margaret Atwood. This book is the dystopian book to end all dystopian books. I think it offers a very terrifying glimpse of the future, which sometimes doesn't feel all that far away from where we are. But it is also a book that's very beautifully written and does offer glimpses of hope, glimpses of kindness, glimpses of the wonders of what it is to be human and to help other people. But is it my favourite book on the list? And is it the book that I'll be championing and discussing and presenting to you next Tuesday? Well, to find out, come and join me and the rest of the panel next Tuesday, 7th of June, 7:30 p.m. at Harrogate Library. Look forward to seeing you there.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's lovely to see you all. So welcome to this Twixt the Covers special Big Jubilee read event at Harrogate Library. It's lovely to see everybody here. I'm Yvette Huddleston, and I'm going to be chatting to these lovely people here. Just before we start, I'll say that we are unable, sadly, to have the fifth member of our panel, who was going to, Kajida Ibrahim, is unable to join us. But we will be talking about her choice as well when we come round to that bit. So I will introduce each of our panel members. To start with, on my left is Cheryl Hesketh, who's a librarian who's worked in public libraries across England and Wales, and she's currently Library Development Manager for Conwy Libraries. She's passionate about the power of reading as a tool for enriching people's lives. And she was also on the selection panel for the Big Jubilee read, so I will be sort of asking her a few questions about that in a minute. James Nichol is a best-selling children's author who's also worked as a bookseller and librarian for more than 20 years, and he continues to do that part-time alongside his writing. He too is a passionate advocate for reading for pleasure and the transformational power of books and stories. And just to say that his hugely popular trilogy, The Apprentice Witch, is being adapted into a TV series by the production company Lime Pictures, so we need to all look out for that soon. And then Jeremy Pointing is the founder and managing editor of Leeds-based independent publisher Peepal Tree Press, which was established in 1985. Since then, the press has published around 450 books, and it's established a reputation as being the foremost publisher of Caribbean literature and an important publisher of Black British writing. And Sue Williamson, who's raced up here from London to join us, thank you, is the Director for Libraries for Arts Council England, and she has many years' experience of working in a variety of roles in public libraries. She's a champion of public libraries and the important part that they play in communities. She's an avid reader, as I think everybody here is, and an advocate for reading for pleasure. And she was very recently awarded an MBE in the Queen's Birthday Honours for her services to the library sector. So that's our panel. So we'll start with Cheryl. So could you just tell us a little bit about the process of selecting these 70 books, which are obviously 10 from each decade of the Queen's reign, but you ended up with 70, but I think you had a long list that was at least twice as long as that, wasn't it? So.
Yes, it was. It was about 150, and the books were from librarians, members of the public. You know, they'd invited people to put forward their suggestions, and when I was invited to be part of the panel, I was initially very excited, and then a bit nervous, and then I thought it'll be okay because I'll probably know most of the books, you know, that I'm being given to read, and I didn't actually, I have to say. I was given just over 20 books to read in a very short period of time, and they were divided by decade, as you know, but really that was kind of the purpose of the list, was to bring books out of the shadows perhaps, and to put books forward that were really needed a wider readership and a bigger audience. So it was a fantastic opportunity to pick up books that I probably never would have read. And although it was a bit daunting, it was it was just a very, very interesting experience. Right. And then we had to come together and whittle our choices. So we had to champion. It was all done over Zoom because obviously COVID and people were spread far and wide. So there were librarians, academics in particularly certain fields of literature, booksellers. We had a few minutes to champion our books and to say why that book should be on the list. And then, so you were really going for it.
It's like pitching to a Hollywood producer or something.
It was really like pitching, and the BBC were there because they were obviously going to be choosing. They had in mind some of these books that they wanted for Between the Covers. And I was really excited because some of my books got chosen for Between the Covers, so that was really good. And then really you kind of sat back and hoped somebody else would agree with you and would also champion that book, and and when they did, you were going, yes. So it was intense, but it was exciting, and it got me. I don't know if anybody else felt like this, but I think I was struck by, throughout COVID, I stopped reading, and what taking part in the panel did for me was to re-engage me, particularly the very first book I read, which I will be championing.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, that's a very good link then to, could you tell us
I could.
of the 70 books you chose as your all-time favourite?
I chose The Crow Eaters. So I don't know how many of you have read this, and if you haven't, then you really should read this as soon as possible. I got my list just before Christmas, and I went into the library, and I thought, right, I'm going to have to read the ones that we've already got in stock first, and I'll order and this happened to be there, and I picked it up, and I'm not sure if I would have picked that book up actually. It's quite an attractive cover, but it's not the sort of book that I would have ever chosen for me. And I started reading, and well, I kind of describe her as a bit of a modern day Jane Austen. She shocks you. She kind of moves you to tears, I think, with some of the characters. They're almost like little short stories within, It wasn't what I was expecting at all.
So what can you just tell us a little bit, because the central character is this very kind of charming, likeable rogue, isn't it, called Fardoon Jungulwala, known as Freddie.
Freddie.
Could tell us a little bit about him and what the sort of story
Yes, well, Freddie, you kind of go through through the book, being fond of Freddie, frustrated by Freddie, exasperated, shocked, and really he takes his family. I didn't know anything about Parsi at all, and I know a bit more now. But he goes with his wife, and his Jerbanu is his mother-in-law. If anyone has a difficult mother-in-law, I bet you don't have a mother-in-law that's anything like Jerbanu. She is quite
an amazing character.
Quite a lady. And you'll be thankful you don't have her as your mother-in-law. But she is such a character. And he basically takes his family and establishes himself, and really becomes quite... well, he's sort of the person, he builds himself up within the community to be the person that people go to for advice, for everything really, don't they? He becomes, and I'm not quite sure how he does it, really.
No, I mean, it's quite interesting what the author does, Babsy Sidwell, because he does some absolutely horrible things in the novel. Yes, he does. Yeah. But you still kind of feel sympathetic towards him. We should say that this is set in India at the turn of the 20th century, isn't it? It's in the early 1900s.
Yes.
And they move from kind of rural India into Lahore, and as you say, that's where he establishes himself.
Yes. Yes, and just builds up this sort of reputation as the man to go to if you want anything sorted, whether it be financial, whether it's relationships. You go to Freddie, and he sorts it. Not always, as Yvette said, he doesn't. Well, sometimes he shocks you. There's certainly, some parts of the book where I was shocked, and almost repulsed by him. But then the author, as you say, is so very cleverly, you feel endeared towards him again. And I guess he's just very human, isn't he?
Yes.
And, you know,
so.
he really does. He's not all one thing or the other any more than any of us are. And you're kind of rooting. You're kind of rooting for Freddie.
The humour in the novel is just amazing. I mean, it's really, really fine comic writing, isn't it? In fact, I mean, Hanif Qureshi described it as one of the great comic novels of the 20th century.
Absolutely.
I'm assuming you'd agree with that.
Well, I think that was near the beginning. There was I'm sure you know what I'm referring to, but there was a little piece near the beginning, and I actually laughed out loud, and you know, that doesn't happen very often. And part of that was I was a bit shocked. She's no holds barred in terms of how she writes, is she? There's nothing is off limits, you know. She'll put anything in there, so be prepared. I'm giving you that warning now. You may be shocked by some of the contents of this book, but that's also really refreshing as well. And there's kind of an honesty as well about it, I think.
And it's anybody who else has read it, please, you know, chip in. But this was her first novel. I mean, I think it's an incredibly accomplished debut. The writing is very, very impressive, isn't it?
Yeah. Absolutely. And there are bits that I've gone back to and you know and read again. And towards the end, there's one little bit that she says about aging. I don't know if you picked that up from one of the characters, and it's the most beautiful and encouraging way to think about aging. And I'm not going to tell you because you need to read the book yourself. But you know, I just read it, and it's just such a hopeful, hopeful phrase in there. There's so much in this book. You know, yes, you really, really should give it a go.
I think it does. It's very evocative as well, isn't it? I mean, we mentioned the setting, but it's. Did you feel kind of transported to Lahore at the turn of the 20th century?
Yes, I did, and I think I did. You know, I did. It's very hard not to. You become so absorbed by the characters, but as you say, there is all that going on as well. Particularly some of the rites around death, the religious rites around death that I wasn't familiar with. I felt I came away understanding a little bit more, but also wanting to delve into that and, you know, and find out more again. So it is kind of informing you as you read it.
Very educational.
It is.
You mentioned the Parsi religion, and they're a minority.
Yes.
You know, you learn a lot about their kind of, you know, values and everything else as well, don't you?
Yeah, and the relationship with the English as well, I thought that was very interesting, and how the English are perceived, and the change in that perception when they do come over to London towards the end of the novel for a period of time, and how they viewed the English people and their behaviour when they were over in Lahore compared to how they lived when they were in London, and there was a stark difference in that.
Was really strong, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
I think the thing that, I mean, listening to you describe her as a modern Jane Austen, I think that's really a good description, because actually, like Jane Austen, she shows characters going through every single emotion, doesn't she? So, I mean, you mentioned that comment about aging, but it's not all funny, this book. There's some there's some really, really harrowing times that they go through as a family, and I think she's pitch perfect, like Jane Austen, all the way through. But it's very much a book, I think. It's very obviously not written by somebody who is English. You know, I mean, it's a very distinct style, I think, a distinct voice rather than style that comes through.
Yes, and it's such a confident voice as well, isn't it? Which is great. Again, you know, I kept thinking, I can't believe this is a debut. You know, it's just very, very good. Yes. Right. Well, I hope that's been added to your reading list, everybody, because it's a brilliant book. So now we're going to move to James, and what are you going to do? The big reveal.
Yeah, so the book I'm championing is The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. And just before we came up, we were chatting in our green room / the library staff room, and you were asking whether I was going to mention the film, which did give away film cover on my copy. This is how I discovered the book, was having been to the cinema and seen the film 3 times, in fact, because I enjoyed the film so much. And when I saw it on the list, it kind of leapt out at me, because I'd loved the film so much and then fell in love with the book afterwards, but also because it was a book I discovered in my first year of being a bookseller. And so I remember kind of just being sort of blown away by this book. I'd never heard of Michael Ondaatje. Obviously, it was a big film at the time, won lots of Oscars, huge star cast. And so I was intrigued to read the book as well, and was then quite shocked at how different the book is from the film. It's just, the film is very linear, the book is not at all. It's like layers upon layers, and you're sort of delving into these people's pasts and their secrets and their stories, and you're sort of almost excavating the story as you go through the pages. And the film is not like that at all. I mean, you get surprises in the film, but not in the same way you get them in the book. And I think the emphasis on certain things is very different in the books than it is in the film too. And I think the other thing that really captured my imagination really was that Hannah, who's one of the characters, we were the same age when I was reading the book. We were both 20 years old, and it's kind of an odd time in your life, isn't it? Because you've kind of almost finished being a kid, but not really, and you don't really feel like an adult. Not that I do now either. But I think that spoke to me as well, because she was, she'd been through this huge turmoil of the Second World War, and losing people, and was suffering, and yet coping in a very, capable way, almost holding the other characters together, who are also, all the characters in the book are kind of falling apart one way or the other, physically as well as mentally. So yeah, I think that that all just spoke to me in lots of different ways, really.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you discovered the film first, as you say. The film came out in 1996, I think, and the novel was published shortly before, well, 4 years before that, in 1992. I mean, it had a lot of attention as a book, didn't it? It was hailed as a masterpiece. It won the Booker.
It might be one of the only books I've ever read that was a Booker winner. I probably shouldn't be admitting that. But my husband, when I first met him, the only books he had on his bookcase were Booker Prize winners. And I was like, did you enjoy them? And he's like, some of them. And I was like, why don't you try some other books then? Maybe you don't like Booker Prize winners. But I didn't. When I went into it, I don't think I knew it had won the Booker. I can see why. It's such a different book, I think, because of the way, you're kind of, it's called The English Patient, but the English Patient is not the main character in this book, to my mind. And we were having this conversation, weren't we? To me, Hannah is the main character, because she is the link to everybody in the book, and she holds the kind of, the attention of everybody. Everybody seems to be there because of Hannah in lots of ways. The patient is only there because she decided they weren't going to move on, and she was going to stay with him so that he could see through the end of his days in sort of relative comfort and seclusion in this abandoned Italian monastery.
Yeah, so we should just say what the setting is. So it's towards the end of the Second World War, isn't it?
So
this
kind of the Germans have sort of retreated further and further through Italy, and Hannah, who's a Canadian nurse, has more or less abandoned her post to care for the English patient, who's this severely burned patient who doesn't seem to know who he is. And they're in this abandoned villa, and into that kind of setting wanders somebody from Hannah's past, a man called David Caravaggio, who she knew as a child, who was a friend of her parents. And it's interesting because he's a really curious character because he's so often through the book described as being a thief. And I'm always like, is it just a metaphor, or is he actually like a proper thief? I mean, there are times when she talks and he talks about breaking into people's houses and feeding the dogs so that the next time he breaks in, the dogs don't make a fuss. And so you kind of think, well, maybe he is a thief, but is it actually a metaphor for something else? I don't know. Maybe I'm not clever enough to work that one out yet. Need to read it again. And then also you get Kip, who's an Indian sapper, who's there, excuse me, clearing mines and bombs, unexploded bombs. And Kip and Hannah form a romantic but very innocent kind of relationship and attachment to one another. And as the book progresses, that sort of the relationship continues. And her relationship with Caravaggio changes as well, because there's a lovely passage where he says, or he's thinking that if he just saw her walking down a street in Paris or some other city, he wouldn't have recognized her as the girl he'd known back in Canada, because she has transformed so differently from the girl she was. But he says she's truly become her own person. She's not kind of sort of parroting things from her parents. She's just, grown and blossomed.
And she's seen, you kind of referred to it a little bit earlier, she's seen a lot as a nurse.
She's seen so much.
Living, working through the past
you can't imagine really. She's been a nurse in the Second World War, so she's seen a lot of loss through that, caring for patients that really, had no hope of ever becoming well again. Her father's been killed at some point during the Second World War as well, and so she's kind of grieving for him. She's also lost a baby at some point, although again it's kind of elusive as to how and where and what's happened. It's kind of referred to several times through a section of the book and then almost never again. So she's really grieving, and you do wonder whether she's kind of, I think Caravaggio thinks that she's clinging to the patient in a kind of last-ditch attempt to save somebody, but I don't think that's true at all. I think she's just super compassionate, and she just wants to kind of care for him, to sort of see him through to kind of the end of his days in comfort and care, really. And I think maybe that's what Caravaggio doesn't necessarily understand, because he's kind of mostly quite a selfish character, I think.
And just a little bit about the structure of the novel as well, which is quite interesting, isn't it?
It's very strange. Yeah, the structure is very strange. Like I said, I think it's kind of like an excavation, because there's a lot to do with the desert and kind of shifting sands, and there's also a lot to do with water and the absence of water. It does feel like a very kind of a story where the characters and the narrative is shifting, and it does, it switches between points of view from the different characters and times. Before the war, after the war, you're with the English patient. I don't want to give too many spoilers, but who he actually is, again, the idea of who he might be shifts as the story goes on, and it's only very near the end where it's actually finally revealed, though I think as the reader, you probably have got there, hopefully, before you're completely told, which is always a nice place to be, isn't it? To make you feel very clever when you've worked it out. So it's told in sort of snatches, like a dream, or I used to keep a dream journal. And also the English patient has this copy of Herodotus that over the years he's pasted photographs and postcards and redrawn maps into it, and it's kind of become this journal and diary and all sorts of things, logbook, and through certain points in the book, Hannah herself starts to do the same thing. So there's this abandoned library in the villa, and most of the books obviously are in Italian, but she scours the shelves for ones that are in English, partly to read to the patient, but also she starts to write her own little memories inside the spaces in the book, not to keep. The patient has kind of kept his Herodotus close, only abandoning it at one point, won't spoil. Whereas Hannah, it seems that she writes the thing and then puts the book back on the shelf presumably for somebody else to discover at some point, which those of us who've worked in libraries for a long time know that happens frequently. People leave things in books for you to discover at a later date.
But I mean, it is interesting because it was Anthony Minghella who made the film in 1996 when it was released. I can remember him talking about the fact that people kept saying to him, "You can't make this into a film. It's impossible because it's such a complex sort of narrative structure." But in fact, it kind of lends itself. I don't know if you all agree, but it feels very cinematic to me.
Yes.
The descriptions of place are very, very real.
I meant to check. I don't know whether it's ever been made into a stage play as well, because I think it would work beautifully as a stage play as well, because it almost feels like these kind of characters suddenly sort of assemble in this kind of one place, and obviously everything plays out almost there on the stage. And I did wonder if anybody had ever done it, but I forgot to check. So that's your homework, everybody, to go and find out whether it's ever been a stage play. But yes, very cinematic. And I remember hearing Michael and Archie speak about it and saying when he was, on set, or when he was talking to Anthony, he would say, "Oh, I'm so pleased you left that bit in from the book." And Anthony would say, "No, we've added that in. That wasn't a bit in the book." He'd kind of lost the thread of what was from the book and what had been created for the film. But I know sometimes people can be a bit, sniffy about, it's like a book and a film, and you should definitely read the book before you see the film. That's not what I did. But I think this is a perfect example of how they are such different mediums. It's like trying to compare a piece of music to a painting or a sculpture. They're not the same medium at all, and books and films aren't the same medium. But this, I think, is genuinely an instance where you've got a beautiful film, which is fantastic, and you've got a beautiful book, which is fantastic too. And whilst, there's a core there that's the story and the characters, there's so many little bits that are so different and wonderful things that aren't in the film that you discover in the book, which make the characters more rich. I think, it's perfect, really. So I win. Let's go home.
Can I ask you, did you say you read the book 3 times?
I've read the book. I think I have read the book probably 3 or 4 times now.
And
I went to see
once?
I know I saw the film 3 times
you
within
saw
the space of about 2 weeks. Because I thought it was just beautiful and wonderful. And I can remember it was still in the days when they had an intermission in the theatre, so you could go get an ice cream.
But you didn't go back to the film after you'd read the book?
I did,
yes,
yeah,
Right,
I did.
that's
I think at one point in my house I had the book, the script from the film as well, which you could buy at that point, the soundtrack, and I think I had the film on 2 VHSs because it was that long ago. I think I was. I think I've grown. I'm not quite as obsessed now.
But
I always think of it as being a book. Because I was just like you, I'd seen the film, but I hadn't read the book. So I read the book, and I thought the film focuses so much on the English patient.
Yes.
Whereas the book, the English patient is just one of the threads going through it. And I think when you talked about shifting sands, because to me this is a book about identity. Every single character in this book is looking for their identity in one way, shape or form. And how they find their identity, how they realise themselves and understand themselves better is for me what this book is all about. I can see why it's really difficult to film that. That kind of search for internal search for yourself is a difficult thing to film. Whereas what happens to him is just makes, as you say, a beautiful film.
Yes, it's a real sort of dramatic, without giving anything away, but there's a dramatic yes.
A question to James. Did you? There were a couple of things about. I'd seen the film first and only read the book when it was sent out to us. But one of the, there were a couple of things that quite fascinated me. One was, that total shift of balance between the two. Obviously you're absolutely right about talking about the different forms and things. But I felt that the kind of the centre of gravity in the book was that triangular relationship, where the English patient is the kind of hole in the middle of it. And that one of the climactic points in the book is the point where Kip walks out on them. And there's a failure of kind of recognition they don't recognise what Kip sees. I mean, it's over the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Yes.
And Kip is quite sure Europe would not have dropped the atomic bomb on any European country. You know, that this is a racial act, and they don't understand that, and he walks out.
Yeah.
The other thing I was interested in, and this may be just to do with what I was also had just been reading. I've been reading a book by Priya Satya, and one of the chapters in it is about, I mean, she's written a much longer book about the fascination of a whole number, you know, from Lawrence of Arabia onwards, about the Middle East and what was going on. And they're interesting things, I mean, so that, you know, the bit about how the English patient comes to end up back in Italy.
Yes.
Where he's shot out of the sky, he's picked up by the Bedouin, and you get the sense that he's a bit puzzled about why the Bedouin have actually protected him. And when you read Priya Satya's book, you realise why the Bedouin, you know, I mean in the film he's only rescued because he can supply them with crucial knowledge. Yeah. He can tell them which bullets fit which guns. But you also know why he's perhaps a bit puzzled why they've saved him. Yeah. They literally almost pickle him, don't they? In the thing, yeah. That there has been this war going on from the sort of 1920s onwards, involving Britain, involving France, all about oil, all about, and the Bedouin are very often very much involved in it, and it's the point where those colonial powers recognise that you don't have to actually send soldiers in. You can send the planes in. Yeah. And they bomb the hell out of some of those villages. And I remember coming across this in Priya Satya's book, Lord Trenchard or something, who was the head of the Air Force, in telling the cabinet that don't worry about this. None of this news really got out very much, but don't worry about this because the Bedouin don't mind being bombed to hell. They actually quite like it. And you realise, you wonder whether some of that kind of stuff was lying slightly behind Michael and Datch's kind of ideas.
There's a lovely passage sort of towards the end where the patient, you know, remembers and is thinking about the kind of the attack on the desert, and you kind of think, it's, you know, why would you bomb sand? What are you gaining from it? There isn't a lot of mention of the human cost to that. And also I think whether he's naive in the fact of what he was doing at the time, the impact that was going to have later on, because effectively they went out with this kind of glorious plan to kind of chart and map the desert, and all they were doing was providing maps for armies and soldiers, you know, several years down the line, and I guess, you know, that's part of his guilt, isn't it? One part of his guilt, probably not the biggest bit, but that's interesting. I think I'd like to read that.
Yeah, I mean, it is about that kind of combined, you know, that utter fascination that a sort of a generation of kind of slightly out of the ordinary Englishmen, Britons, and of the other Europeans had with that area. It's very much a kind of Orientalist kind of thing, but a fascination with the place and the feeling of the utter difference of the people who actually live there. Yeah. But behind that kind of cultural thing, there's a lot of kind of, as you say, mapping going on, which was all about, I mean, Mesopotamia, Iraq, all about who gets the oil.
So yes, go on.
I was just going to say that in terms of the writing, I found it very sort of poetic.
Yes, beautiful.
And not a book that you could rush through.
No.
A book that you just sort of read in very small pieces. And I read somewhere as well that somebody had talked about actually reading it out loud, and I thought, yes, that actually makes sense to me, because it is so beautifully and poetically written.
Absolutely.
Beautiful prose.
Yeah, one of the reviewers described the language as being of such riveting beauty that one is made to stop and stare. And I think I definitely did stop and stare quite a few times. So
it's the sort of book you reread bits just because of, you know, the joy of reading them. It's lovely. The whole bit when they're talking about, you know, the beauty of the name Libya, and how, you know, how it something to do with, you hear the twist in your tongue as you say the name Libya. When you take the politics out of it, that's what I think take the politics out of it. You hear the twist in the tongue when you say Libya.
But it's not a difficult read, though.
No,
don't
not
it's
at
not.
all.
It's
No.
not. It's not a dense or opaque book to read. It's really readable. I think. I absolutely loved it. I really did.
I think it absolutely grabs you. It's very, very compelling, and yes, and there's so much going on. I mean, we've mentioned, you know, obviously the philosophy, the politics that are underneath there, and you know, the beautiful language, the love story. So yes, what's not to like? So thanks, James. Right, so Jeremy, we're going to turn to you now, and can you tell us what your choice is?
I totally cheated, actually. I mean, yeah, so I mean, let me find. Yeah, so this is my official choice. My Bones and My Flute by Edgar Mittelholzer, which we'll talk about. My original choice was the Roger Mays book. I mean, these are, but I have to confess, they're very self-interested choices because they're both books that People Tree republished in. We've got a Caribbean modern classic series, so that was part of it. If I might do just before I talk a bit about, particularly about my Bones and My Flute, is just to say something about somebody else who is on the 70 books list, George Lamming. I want to talk about George Lamming because he died just 3 or 4 days ago, and his first book, In the Castle of My Skin, which it's 1954, so it comes in between the Roger Mays. So there are 3 Caribbean books. But just to say a word or two about George Lamming. I mean, he died just 4 days short of his 95th birthday. And so he had a good long life. He only actually wrote 5 novels. But they're novels, and the most recent one was written over 50 years ago. But there are 5 novels which absolutely kind of remain essential, because he had the unerring instinct of knowing what the crucial issues were in terms of where the Caribbean was going from the 1930s, 40s onwards through to now. I've met him once or twice. He was an amazing speaker, a very, very kind of cultivated man. Perhaps just to say a word or two about, because it is on the list, although nobody else has it. And this is the original edition of the book, the American one. It's set in the 1930s, and it's about a young man who is called GL, who of course is George Lamming. So it's an autobiographical book, and it's about his growing up in a Barbadian village, and it's a village, this is in the 1930s, where things have not changed very much at all. It's a village which is known as Creighton Village, because the people who own most of the land are the Creightons, who are a white family who used to own slaves at one point. And they remain the power in that kind of area. So it's a novel about different kinds of Caribbeans at the point. It's about how GL grows. I mean, he grows up under the Union Jack. There's a famous scene of an Empire Day where everybody's having to cheer. They know more about the English monarchy than they know anything about their own history and so on at that kind of point. It's a kind of horrific school where there's a horrible scene of beatings and things, which was the way that people felt that you had to get education into people. But then it's also about the different kinds of things going on, the things that are beginning to change things. So that part of the scene is his deeply affectionate relationship with his grandparents, Ma and Pa. And Ma and Pa are they're the last surviving kind of peasant villages. They live comfortably. They're deeply religious people. They have no sense of history at all. So that despite the fact that they're living right next door to a sugar plantation, which still retains all its links to slavery and so on, they've let all that wash over them. And that's and that's part of the thing where GL both dotes on his grandparents, but also he can't live with their life anymore. He has a friend called Trumper, and Trumper goes off to the USA and comes back radicalized. He's met radical black people in America, and so this is a kind of movement which is coming up. There's a character. I mean, Lamming is quite Dickensian in this. He has a character called Mr. Slime. And Mr. Slime, I think at one point is a school teacher, if I remember right. But Mr. Slime represents of the new middle classes who see which way things are going. So whereas the grandparents, everything about land is kind of customary. They don't actually own it, but it's theirs. Whereas Mr. Slime is all about the buying and selling of land. And he's part of that new middle class which will seize the kind of movement towards independence and leave the kind of the poorer people well behind. They're the ones who step into the shoes of the departing English. So perhaps just to, and in the end, Lamming has to leave, and there's a beautiful scene where there is a Last Supper, and his mother makes cuckoo and flying fish, and there's a long description of how he does it, and his mother kind of is catechizing him about, because she's frightened to death that he will change. He knows he wants to change. And she's, again, a deeply religious woman who is warning him about how bad things are. And he's going to go to Trinidad, where life is a lot livelier. And she's warning him all the bad things that are there. And there's this beautiful scene where, he and his mother are fencing with each other. But she's feeding him this beautiful food, and he will never forget that food. And he knows that there will never be a meal like it ever again. And just read the very first paragraph and the very last paragraph, because they say everything about what you can begin to imagine the passage. So it's a book I would highly recommend, even though it's not one we're meant to be talking about today.
That's all right, as long as you get on to your next one.
I will do. So it begins, rain, rain, rain. My mother put her head through the window to let the neighbour know that I was 9, and they flattered me with the consolation that my birthday had brought showers of blessing. The morning laden with clouds soon passed into noon, and the noon neutral and silent into the sodden grimness of an evening that waded through water. That evening, I kept my eye on the crevices of our wasted roof, where the colour of the shingles had turned to morning black, and waited for the weather to rehearse my wishes. But the evening settled on the slush of the roads, dissolved in parts into pools of clay, and I wept for the watery waste of my 9th important day. Yet I was wrong, my mother protested. It was irreverent to disapprove the will of the Lord or reject the consolation that my birthday had brought showers of blessings. And then right at the very, very end, after this meal, after he's saying goodbye to everybody, and it ends, the last short paragraph, the earth where I walked was a marvel of blackness, and I knew, in a sense more deep than simple departure, I had said farewell to the land. Wow. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah,
and all of his books are well worth reading.
That's a very beautiful tribute to him. Thank you for that, yes. Jeremy.
Okay.
And then your choice of My Bones and My Flute by Edgar Mittelholzer, which is a 1955.
Yes, 1955 book, yes.
First published. Yes, tell us a bit about it, because it's a really intriguing sort of ghost story, adventure, but lots of different things going on in it.
It's strange. I mean, I have to confess, it's probably not my favourite Mittelholzer novel, although I'm a huge admirer of Mittelholzer. And, we brought back into print about half a dozen of his earlier books. I mean, I think Mittelholzer he was a very, really interesting kind of character. He was he came from the very lightest skinned mixed race class in what was then British Guyana, He was he was a kind of rebel in the place. He was going to be a writer right from the very beginning. And apparently he racked up the record for the number of rejections that any kind of writer had done. He was unlucky. I mean, he had a brilliant book that was published in 1943 called Quarantine Thunder. And the public in the stock of the books during the war, the publishers' offices were bombed. So every single copy, virtually every copy of Quarantine Thunder was destroyed. So his chances of making a name for himself kind of disappeared that way. In later life, I think he went off the rails, really, in the sense that I mean, he was one of the very first West Indian writers to come to Britain to make his fortune, to establish a writing career. He was one of the very first West Indian writers to actually establish a writing career. He lived by his writing. I mean, he didn't work at a university. He sold books. And there's a fascinating kind of, I mean, I've got a collection of Mittelholzer books, and the paperbacks are quite astonishing. You know, they're quite salacious, the covers on these books. So he was somebody who actually sold into the mass paperback market. He was also, a serious writer. And I think, I mean, that My Bones and My Flute is a really interesting one. I mean, it's probably a lot of people's favourite Mittelholzer. I mean, the ones we've done, it probably sells the best. And and I think various people have been promoting it even before the Big Jubilee kind of thing as being a fine book. And it's a bit, I suppose, it's a bit like the kind of, Graham Greene had his serious novels and he also had his entertainments. And I think My Bones and My Flute is one of Mittelholzer's entertainments. But he also deals with some quite very serious kind of matters in it. Do you want me just say a little bit about the basic plot?
Well, it is, because, the setting, it's British Guiana in 1933, isn't it? And there's this, so it's a kind of ghost story, really. You say it's an entertainment. So yes, there's the ghost of a Dutch slave owner who... Yeah, so it's sort of,
the book is told, I mean, it's a kind of... Mittelholzer, in his introduction to the book, describes it as an a deliberately kind of old-fashioned kind of ghost story. And it's kind of based on the kind of the stories of something like M.R. James or something, those kinds of things. It's a ghost story that works by suggestion more than by any kind of gothic kind of horror. But it's a serious story also about how the past doesn't go away. So it's told by this character called Milton Woodsley, who one realizes is of course, a kind of alter ego for Mittelholzer. Mittelholzer means middle of the wood. So he has this character called Milton Woodsley. And Milton Woodsley is this kind of, as I say, a kind of alter ego for Mittelholzer himself. He's this artist, he's rebellious, he's bohemian, and he knows his family. So they're both from the kind of, sort of apart from the kind of few genuinely, totally English people, they're from the highest strata of Guyanese society, which at those stages is still totally kind of measured by class and colour. The blacker you were, the lower down the status ladder you were, the whiter you were, the higher up the status ladder you are. And there's this character called Mr. Nevinson, and Mr. Nevinson is from this kind of class, a kind of very decent, open-minded kind of man who is fascinated by the past, and he collects kind of ephemera, and he collects documents and things from that. But he treats it all in a very antiquarian kind of way. It's just fascinating kind of stuff to have, despite the fact that some of the stuff that he collects is about the Berbice Slave Rebellion. And the Berbice Slave Rebellion was one of the most, it shook the kind of colonial empire. Apart from the Haitian Revolution at the end of the beginning of the 19th century, it was the one almost successful slave rebellion. And it took something like 6 to 9 months for the colonial authorities to put it down. And it, you know, so that it kind of really kind of tore through the country. And Mr. Nevinson, who is this character, for him, all of this is well in the past. It's old history. He even has a cottage, a country cottage that he goes to visit, that's in Berbice, and it happens to be on the site of this old abandoned sugar plantation. But there are strange things that begin to happen. For instance, he starts hearing this flute, and he doesn't know where the hell this flute noise is coming from. And he begins to worry him a bit. So he decides he really ought to involve somebody else. So he invites Milton Woodsley to come with him and his wife and daughter. And I think they're also trying to set up Milton with the daughter as well. So there's this kind of, you know, there's some quite funny stuff in it as well as that. And he wants Milton to be witness to what's going on. And Milton is the person then who 20 years later is telling the story of remembering of what's happened. But it's a story about how, I mean, so that, for instance, when Milton first goes there, he begins to think, and he writes, I was smiling to myself, and I was thinking about how this estate might have been. And he has this picture of kind of enterprise and energy and the growing of sugarcane and stuff. But then suddenly in his mind, the image comes in of black bodies which are covered in blood. And as the picture that he's had begins to disappear. So I'm not going to tell you much more about the story because there'll be too many spoilers in it.
Yeah.
But perhaps just to say the other kind of key element in it is that it's also a novel about 1930s, 1940s Guyana, because it's not just Milton and Mr. and Mrs. Nevinson and the daughter Nevinson, but Rayburn. I can remember that. And Rayburn is the family's loyal servant who's black. And there comes one of the things that comes a point in it where things begin to start happening very strangely around this cottage. That Mr. Nevinson thinks, perhaps it would be a good idea if Rayburn moved in with us, but Mrs. Nevinson won't have it. How can we rub shoulders with this black man? It's not as serious as that, but of course it is as serious as that. And in the end, it's Rayburn who rescues the family from what you'd have to discover yourselves. So it's both a very, very entertaining novel, one that works in a quite chilling kind of way in places, because you wonder how much is coming from inside people, how much is actually there. And there's
also this sort of very ethereal, this flute playing as well.
Yeah.
You almost start to hear in your head, and that's the ghost is playing this flute. So anybody who's touched this manuscript that you mentioned, is going to be haunted in that way. So yes, I mean the influence of M.R. James and that kind of Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, it is actually referenced within the text, isn't it? So if you like those kind of ghost stories, I think it would appeal, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But as I say, it's a ghost story where there are other things, lots of things going on as well. Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
And funny in parts.
Yeah. Yes, he's got a really interesting turn of phrase, I think. Yeah. Yes. Right. We might come back to, if we have time, A Grain of Wheat, but I think we move on to you, Sue, and can you reveal your choice?
Yeah. So my choice is The Secret River by Kate Grenville. And I mean, those of you who do know me, and there are some in the audience, know that I am a voracious reader, but my first love has always been historical novels. And that's why I latched onto this one. And Kate comes from Australia, and she started to write this book because she wanted to. She learned about her great grandfather, who was transported to Australia as a convict. And he got to Australia in the early 1800s, and he basically got a pardon, and he became very wealthy, and that's about all she knew about him. And when she was a small child, her mother took her to a pub which used to be on the site of where the family used to live. And there were all kinds of family legends that he'd pushed his wife down the stairs because he wanted to get rid of her to marry somebody else. So she decided that she would find out about what happened to him. Now, there's this book, and there's also this book, which is Searching for the Secret River, which describes how she went about researching what happened to her grandfather. Coming back from her great-great-great-great-grandfather, coming back from Australia to London and trying to find the records, discovering that the churches that were likely to have all the records in were bombed, that there were 7 or 8 people with his name at about the right kind of time, and how was she going to find out about this? And this is her journey. And it's the most fascinating insight into the way a writer thinks. Because when she started thinking about all this, she was going to write non-fiction. She's a novelist, but this book was going to be non-fiction. It was going to be the story of her great-great-great-great-grandfather. And then it just didn't work. She said, every time I try and write it, it's boring. She said, I can't get interested in it at all. And all these other characters kept popping into her head. So she moved from writing the non-fiction book to writing the fiction book. And she changed the story a bit. So the names changed, the circumstances have changed, and you learn so much. So I didn't know, for example, I knew from somewhere in the past that the reason Australians call women Sheilas is because they're she-lags, which is wives of convicts, or partners of, or women of, or whatever you want to call them, she-lags. But what I didn't know was that when somebody was sentenced to transportation, at various points of time during the history of transportation, if they were married, they were allowed to take their families with them. Oh, that's rather nice, you think? Until you realise that actually, when they got to the other side, to Australia, the government basically gave them a lean-to shack, a week's full of rations, and said, you are now indentured as a slave to your wife. So she is therefore responsible for you. We don't have anything else to do with it. So you either sink or swim or die or live, dependent upon how you adapt to this climate. And can you imagine arriving in Australia into temperatures such as you've never known? The heat, the flies, the dust, the bugs, the snakes, all the weird creatures that you've never seen before. And there you are in this strange environment, told basically to get on with it. And what comes across in the book is when they're in London and he marries this person, Sal, he's marrying up. And gradually, when Sal's father dies, it's this classic thing where you discover that her father was in debt, and suddenly the bottom falls out of their world. And he's what's known as a lighterman. And that is a bargee on the Thames, and lightermen transported goods, and watermen transported people. And he was a lighterman. And he had a little side order on the side of smuggling wood. He would pinch wood and sell it on, basically, offcuts. And he got caught. And for that's the reason why he was transported. So you've got this character who has come from quite a relatively affluent background in Sal. And she arrives in Australia, lean-to hut, a baby and a small toddler, and told to get on with it. And I'm just thinking, oh my God, that must have just been horrendous. And what you see is that the fact that if it's a strong partnership, then it works. But if it isn't, then it doesn't. And what you see in the book is a partnership that starts out as strong, and she gradually gets more and more nostalgic for England and wants to go back and keeps thinking about this. Whereas actually the real person was very much a millstone round the guy's neck, and he ended up pitching her down the stairs, as we understand. So that's the basic story. He gets pardoned, and he as a riverman, he's able to use his skills, and he sees this spot on the river, and he thinks, that's where I want to be. That's where I want to set up a business. I want to start farming. I want to set up a business. And he does that. And this is where the book gets real. This is the other part of the book, which is her exploration of what it meant to be basically a culture that walked in on somewhere and said, right, we're here now, so it belongs to us. And everybody who lives here, well, nobody owns anything, so we're just going to take it. So you get the two cultures of the Aborigines and the white people coming together, and the differences in culture are just huge. I mean, so for the white man, if they've got scars on their back, it's because they've been punished. The Aborigine does ritual scarring, and it shows bravery and resilience. The white man says, I'm going to own this land, I'm going to farm it, I'm going to put a fence around it, and it's mine. The Aborigine says, nobody owns land, but we all own the land. So when the English farmers pull up the crops that the Aborigines live off, because they think they're weeds, and they don't know what they are, the Aborigines will starve. But the English people plant other crops, and the Aborigine thinks, oh, well, that's food. Food belongs to everybody, like food always belongs to everybody. So they take the crops. So gradually what happens is you get these two peoples moving further and further and further apart, and the whole thing descends into violence. And it's how this ancestor of hers gets sucked into this violence. And part of the whole of the narrative in both the books is her learning about the history of the Aboriginal people, as well about the history of her own people. And that's what made them so fascinating for me.
It is. I mean, she dedicates the novel to the Aboriginal people,
she
doesn't
does,
she?
Yes.
And I mean, some of the violence is just as a sort of warning, really, is really quite upsetting. William Thornhill is the name of the character, isn't
yes,
it?
That's right,
in the novel, and you mentioned his wife Sal, and that relationship is very interesting, isn't it? And you say it's quite strong,
but it gets weaker.
Yes, yeah. It's complex, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's really interesting the way that she explores that, Grenville, and the kind of power shifts within that relationship, which kind of mirrors what's going on in the, around them in the wider world. I also really just would like to ask you about how interesting that contrast is, because we are in London for quite a big chunk of the beginning of the novel, aren't we, in 1806, and that the contrast between the sort of grinding poverty of a certain class of Londoner at that time, and then the new possibilities, which William really wants to embrace, doesn't he? But as you say, Sal is kind of resistant slightly to that.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, I think, because I mean, you're right about the grinding poverty, and that's the background that William comes from, but Sal doesn't. Sal comes from a slightly better off merchant type of family to whom William is apprenticed, and that's how they meet in the first place, as a lighterman. And so she has that sort of that memory in her head of the best times that she was in London at that time, and she very conveniently, like I think a lot of expatriates do, forgets the bits that they don't like and just remembers and starts, sort of building up, in 3 years we can go home, in 4 years we can go home, and why haven't we gone home? And that gradually eats away at their relationship, because he is remembering, actually it was horrible. It was, it was really, and here there are possibilities. I can build a farm, I can grow the land, I can own it. I'd never have the possibility of being able to do any of that at home. And that's really where he comes from. And it's really the kind of violence that we're talking about against the Aborigines that they descend into. It's the crowd mentality. There are other people, other white people settling who have a much more adversarial set of thoughts about the black people who come in and disappear. They're frightened of them, basically. And so gradually, over time, he feels he's got to go with them. He's got to be part of that, rather than at the very beginning, he's going, well, no, surely we can all coexist in this space. There's masses of space. But over time, I think Sal in particular starts to really get infected by the fear of what these people might do.
And that's terrible. It's so sad.
It is really sad,
yes.
yeah.
Because you're sort of, as a reader, you're kind of hopeful because of their sort of attitude initially, especially Williams, you know, but then you can see that gradual sinking into, you know, the sort of prevailing attitudes, as you said.
But one of the things that Kate says in this book is, where she's talking about this, is that her mother, when she was a small child, told her that when she asked about the Aboriginal people, said, oh, they'd all gone. They'd all gone by the time the convicts arrived, and so it wasn't a problem. And the whole, she said, that, you know, at school, the whole ignorance about the Indigenous people that she grew up with, she just finds absolutely appalling in her adult life, which is what made her want to write this book. So I think I loved the book because it was a real page-turner, and B, I really enjoyed this because it was you don't often, it's a bit like when you go to a music concert and you hear somebody perform and they don't talk to you, and you have this massive communion with this musician, and then they disappear. And on the times when they do talk to you about what they've been doing and why they've been doing it, it's really very personal. You think, you know, I've had this connection. And I found that exactly the same with this, that I, you know, having read the book, reading her thought processes and her investigative processes as she found out more and more about her ancestor, I felt it was a really intimate thing that I was being part of. So I thought it was a really great reading experience. I commend it to you.
It's a very powerful book, yes. Sorry, go on.
I'm halfway through it, and two of the things that struck me, the poverty, I found shocking. I couldn't believe it was as bad as it's described. But the other thing that struck me, and maybe this is going to change after hearing what you've said, was just how resilient Sal was, and how she, for me, kind of becomes the main character. And I don't know if that's going to be the same, but she stands out, and I just couldn't believe. I thought everybody needs a Sal in their life because she's so incredibly resilient. But I guess I'll just have to finish the book and see how that changes.
It does change, and I think it goes back to what I said earlier, that actually from at the beginning, if you're not a strong unit, I could imagine people turning up in that situation where, you know, where they're not a strong unit, and the woman is not practical and doesn't support sort of them building a life there, that it would have just fallen apart really, really quickly. So yes, at the beginning she is, but I think it's when they move out of the city and go into the bush. Yeah, basically.
We're just about yes.
Yeah, that it all starts to fall apart a bit. So sorry.
Yes. I didn't know Kate Grenville's. I'm very grateful to have been brought to attention. But I also then read the Searching for the Secret River. And one of the things that struck me was the absolute honesty of that book. Because when I read the novel first, and one of the things I wondered about was the kind of, one never sees that world from the Aborigines' eyes. And you wonder whether that's a failing. But I think Kate is very, very honest in the things where, you know, she goes out in search, and she admits right then she still doesn't really quite know where these people are coming from. She realizes there are layers and layers, and she's not going to get into the culture because they're not going to tell her. And that's one thing. I mean, one of the other, there's another book I would recommend as to knowing more about the beginnings of that. There's a brilliant book by a historian called Peter Limebaugh, and it's called The London Hound. And what it makes very clear is that what happens to the family is not an accident. I mean, it's also mentioning that in fact that he's sentenced to be hung. And he's sentenced to be hung for doing essentially was what everybody was doing. People who were low paid regarded it as perks to get a little bit of the wood. You know, And one of the, and that had been going on for a long, long time.
But it wasn't, sorry to interrupt, but it wasn't even just perks, it was kind of to be able to put food on the table.
Put food on the table,
Yes,
But the
yes.
people regard it as perks, it was part of the job. And one of the things the things that Peter Limeborn makes very clear in this book, called The London Hound, is that in that point in the kind of, from about the mid-1750s onwards, there is a horrific kind of increase in the number of so-called offences for which hanging was the sentence. You stole a silk handkerchief, you could be hung. And this was all, so this is all about, this is the beginnings of sort of commercial capitalism, the fact of a middle class beginning to own things, only having luxuries. So there has to be protected. So there, for the people who get transported, it's the new factories, the declining work on the farms, it's the poorhouse, or it's prison, or it's Tyburn and the noose, or it's it's being expelled to Australia.
So in a sense, you can understand, just to come back to this, you're saying it's exploring the concept of ownership, and so in a sense, you can understand Williams, why he's so desperate.
Yeah,
he wants
absolutely.
to make his mark, and he wants
yes,
it to be his, doesn't he?
Yeah. And
But
also, when Kate comes to London, she comes because it's an author's symposium, and she one of the people who's in the symposium with her is an Aboriginal author whose name escapes me, but she's telling her the story of what she's doing, and she says he took up she uses the phrase about her ancestor, he took up the land, and the other woman corrects her and says, no, he took the land. And that, I think, is the key thing, is that this whole sense of ownership and what ownership means is so important around this, and why the two cultures found it so very difficult to come together. And the particular Aboriginal tribe that this book talks about were nearly all wiped out. And so, and again, she finds that out when she's doing her research. So for any of you who are historians in there, I think you would find this really fascinating.
Right.
There's a nice bit in the searching for the river, where she's trying to meet a number of and sort of trying to explore that thing. And when she hears people talking to each other, she thinks first they're talking a foreign language, and then she thinks, no, hang on, I'm the one who's talking a foreign language.
Right, so another fascinating choice. So I hope we've given you lots to think about here. So because I'm going to turn to you now and see if there are any questions you'd like to pose to the panel. And Sarah's got a roving microphone. If you just want to put up your hand if you have any questions.
Everyone's too scared. We've battered them into submission, I think.
No? Oh, yes, good.
Hi, it's been really interesting listening to your choices this evening, but I wondered if there are any key novels, significant novels you think are missing from the list?
Oh, gosh.
Is that for anybody?
Is that for anybody?
Yeah.
It's difficult when you're
It's
putting a
really
list together.
difficult.
Yes,
It's
I think
really difficult. I think we I wanted all the novels that I read, all 20 of them, to be on the list. But there was a list of, of 70 books. No, I think it was a fairly representative mix, I've got to say. I think, I think there was a lot of thought and discussion went into trying to provide a balance. And they kind of went away and thought about it and came back if there were a few that we weren't sure about. So I actually think it was,
it looks like a really
it's
interesting,
okay.
good
I think
mixture, actually.
it is, because I think there are a lot of things. Well, I don't know about all of you, but I'd probably ask that question to you. But are there a lot of books on there that you perhaps were not aware of before the list came out?
Which is
really kind of the purpose of the list, to introduce readers to to new reads, to books that we might not have discovered. So in that sense, I think it's successful. I'd have liked more Welsh books on, but I'm going to say that, and the person from Scotland, and you can go on and on and on. But I think it's a really exciting, a really exciting list, and certainly it's got some titles in there that, well, I'd have been sorry if I'd missed this one. And there's lots that I felt like that. And the other thing is, there are some books on there that I might have not been brave enough to read because they might be shocking, or that I would be frightened of how I would feel in terms of reading them. But it's kind of made it safe in the sense to explore and to discover reads that, without the list, I wouldn't have picked up. So I don't know what anybody else feels.
I've certainly found when I've been sharing the list, doing my reader development work in the library and sharing the list with readers and things, and sort of saying, have you had a look at the books? Here's the list. People tend to open it and start scanning through, and they go, oh yes, I've read that, oh I've read that. But then they sort of pause and they kind of look a bit more closely, and you can see them sort of thinking, oh, this is quite interesting, I don't know that author, and I think what you were saying about it being safe, the fact that, we've made these collections available through the library, it is a safe way for people to dip into things, and if they don't like it, they've not lost anything from having borrowed the books from the library. But I think, it's a bit cliche to say there's something there for everybody, but it does feel that it's that there is something that will draw you in, because you'll think, oh well, I've read that book, I know that author, but I don't know that book. Because they're presented as a whole, that people will feel more, there's that confidence, and because they've been selected by, reputable people.
Such as you,
Yeah, in terms of reader development, it's all about taking risks, encouraging people to take risks with their reading, because we all get stuck in ruts, and and
I think it certainly does
really
that. Yes, it opens up a whole...
pushes you out of that rut.
I think that was the point, really, was the idea, and I think also the link to the Commonwealth, the idea that we've got the Commonwealth Games this year, the Queen and her with her Jubilee. One of the real passions that she's had throughout, a thread that's gone through her entire reign, has been about her love for the Commonwealth. And I think one of the things that shocked me when I looked at the list was just how many writers I'd never heard of. And I've been working with books in libraries for more years than I'm going to admit to. And I've had a drink, and I haven't had one yet tonight. I think that was really the point, was to try and sort of show people that that there was a lot of really great stuff out there that had a relationship with us. I think that maybe we'd never been aware of or never explored.
Yes. And the one of the kind of the poignancy was that a book set in Lahore about family life could actually speak to somebody who'd grown up in a very small village, Welsh village on Anglesey, and you could recognise the same experiences in the same way that the book from Wales, which I've got to get a plug for, because One Moonlit Night, which it was very touching to hear the other people on the panel and it wasn't me who was given this to read, the way they approached it and how they felt about a book set in a very rural, you might say backward Welsh community with very strange views about things. And so it's breaking down all those barriers between us and kind of bringing us together. And you see that there are far more similarities, which I thought was really exciting.
I mean, it could have been, it's not, but the danger is it could have been a very uninspiring list if it wasn't, that breadth of the Commonwealth. If it was just 70 books from 70 years, we could have ended up with stuff that we've all seen over and over again. And it's not at all. It's a really lovely eclectic list.
Yes. Have we got any other questions? Yes, the front here.
Actually, I think the point about the Welsh village may just have answered my question, but I'll try it anyway. Is it a problem or ironic that most of these Commonwealth authors are coming from a fairly small cultural population group? I mean, even when it's India, we're talking about the Farsis who are a small group, and yet to be commercially successful, they've got, or because of that, to be commercially successful, they've got to appeal to a UK audience. And would they be writing different books if they were marketing it just for their own culture?
I think the UK book market is a lot smaller than we imagine it is. I think we think it's a lot bigger, but it's... Yeah, definitely. But those books most likely have been sold, the rights would have been sold to other countries as well, and the UK may be just a small portion of it.
I mean, it's probably worth just saying that I mentioned that Mittelholtz was one of the very first people, but virtually every significant Caribbean novelist ended up in London in the 1950s and 1960s. The fact that, the BBC was a major kind of source of any kind of funding for Caribbean. There was a program called Caribbean Voices, which actually paid people for their stories and their poems and things. And that was a crucial thing. So yes, there is a major, there wasn't, and there still really isn't, a kind of a literary publishing industry, for instance, in the Caribbean. There's a massive publishing industry in India now. But, just for the Caribbean, which I know, there is still a major problem for writers for deciding who it is they're actually writing for. We always say, look, if you're a Trinidadian, write for a Trinidadian audience. If it's good, it'll have legs, it'll speak to other people. But there is attempt. And one of the things, when you read some of the books that came out in the 60s and 70s, you keep on finding kind of insertions into the books, explanations of things, which no Caribbean reader would have needed. So they're there for English readers, and they're kind of intrusive. So I think it's a good question, that, and I think it's one that probably is for smaller territories. Somewhere like think about somewhere like Grenada. Lots of good novelists have come from Grenada. Grenada has a population of about 130,000. You can see that there is hardly a market for books there. So if you're a Grenadian novelist, then you need to be in the States or you need to be here.
Right, I think we might have time for just one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up if there is one. Yeah. Right, well, in that case, I think we'll say thank you very much to our wonderful panel here. Thank you all for coming to listen to us speak tonight, which has been a fascinating discussion, I hope, and everybody who's watching at home. And I'd like to thank Harrogate Library for hosting this, and North Yorkshire County Council. So that's it. Let me say thank you to our panellists.